I stood in front of my mother's husband in my underwear, his eyes sliding over me as if he could no longer control himself. His chest rose rapidly, his fingers trembling as he ran them over my wrist, and I did not take a single step back. The air between us became heavy, sticky, filled with forbidden desire. His warm breath burned my neck as he leaned in closer, and my heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I should have walked away, should have said something to ruin this moment, but instead I felt his arms slowly, dangerously wrap around my waist. I was 20 years old when my mother announced that she was getting married. I didn't attach any significance to it. After all, it was her third marriage, and I was indifferent. The wedding passed with few complications, and I assumed life would continue as usual. But after the celebration, something began to change. Dennis, the man who became my stepfather, was unlike anyone my mother had married before. He wasn't merely wealthy and influential. He possessed an undeniable magnetism that made people submit to him without even realizing it. At first, I kept my distance, watching him navigate our family dynamics with an air of confidence. However, over the following days, he started finding excuses to be near me. His presence became more frequent, and each encounter left me with mixed feelings of curiosity and unease. One cool, quiet evening, long after the rest of the household had retired to bed, I remained in the living room near the fireplace. The soft crackle of burning logs was the only sound accompanying my solitary thoughts. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. The sound was subtle, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a low, almost confidential tone that broke the silence. His voice was calm and deliberate, carrying an undercurrent of intimacy. I barely managed a nod in response, caught off guard by his sudden presence. Without waiting for an invitation, he sat down next to me. In that brief moment, his hand brushed lightly against my shoulder, an act so gentle it could have been accidental. Yet, it carried a weight that I could not ignore. He continued, his eyes fixed on mine. "You've changed a lot in these months. You've grown up," he remarked. As he spoke, his fingers instinctively brushed through a lock of my hair. The simple contact made my heart race and left me momentarily breathless. I felt an unexpected tension build inside me, a conflict between the logical caution I had always maintained and the stirring of new, unsettling emotions. In that instant, I became acutely aware of the subtle shift within me. I had always been detached from the intricacies of my mother's relationships, but now, faced with Dennis's deliberate closeness, I felt an undeniable pull. His presence, the way he observed me, and the slight brush of his hand all contributed to a growing internal turmoil. I tried to rationalize the situation, reminding myself that this was the man my mother had chosen, a man with power and influence far beyond the ordinary. And yet, the simplicity of that touch unsettled me more than I expected. The room was dimly lit by the flickering flames, and every detail seemed heightened. I looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. His calm expression gave nothing away, yet his gaze was intense, as if he was measuring every change in me. I considered moving away, reasserting the distance I had maintained since the wedding. But the unspoken invitation in his tone made me hesitate. I realized that this encounter was more than a simple act of casual intimacy. It marked the beginning of a transformation I had not foreseen. Every second stretched out as I struggled with my inner thoughts. The logical part of my mind screamed to maintain boundaries, while another part, more impulsive and daring, urged me to let this moment pass without interference. The tension was palpable, and I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step back or lean into the unknown. I sat there, silent, as the implications of his touch and words sank in. The shift was subtle yet undeniable, a moment where the ordinary blurred with something unexpected and potentially dangerous. It was as if the calm night had given way to a storm of new emotions and possibilities, each one threatening to upend the familiar order of my life. In that quiet, charged moment, I knew that everything was about to change. My indifference had been replaced by an internal conflict that I could no longer ignore. I was no longer just an observer in my own life. I was being drawn into a dynamic that promised both allure and peril. The boundaries between right and wrong, distance and closeness, seemed to blur before my eyes. I felt the weight of destiny drawing me forward, into a future filled with unforeseen consequences. That moment lasted only a few seconds, but something inside me turned over. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Dennis found more ways to compliment my appearance and drop unmistakable hints. I felt both compelled and strangely enticed by his attention, an attention that was entirely unexpected. My mother, who had never shown such care before, now seemed unusually involved in his life. It made everything feel even more complicated. I tried to keep my distance, but Dennis was relentless. Every encounter brought with it a new layer of intensity that I hadn't anticipated. He would casually mention how much he admired the way I carried myself, noting small details about my look that I had never considered significant. His compliments were straightforward, yet laced with a suggestion that there was more beneath the surface. I felt pressured by the frequency of his remarks and the subtle way they undermined my usual reserve. It was as if his praise carried a hidden meaning, one that I was not entirely ready to decode. Then one night, while the house was cloaked in darkness and quiet, he approached me with a proposal that left little room for refusal. "Your shoulder pain. I can help," he said with a seriousness in his tone that caught me off guard. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. I found myself agreeing without a word. The offer came so naturally, so convincingly, that I hardly questioned the intentions behind it. I soon found myself lying on my stomach on a large mattress in his office, a space that was usually strictly professional. The dim light did little to hide the clinical look of the room, yet every sound was magnified in the silence. I could hear him moving about as he prepared the massage oil, the clinking of the bottle and the soft stirring of the liquid filling the quiet. As I lay there, I tried to calm my racing thoughts, but the situation was far from relaxing. Before I fully registered what was happening, his hands were on my shoulders. The warmth of his touch spread slowly, almost methodically, across my back. It was undeniably pleasant, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to relax. But that feeling quickly gave way to discomfort as his fingers began their journey downward along my back. I couldn't tell if it was intentional or merely an extension of the massage, but each slight movement made my skin tingle with a mix of pleasure and embarrassment. I started breathing faster, my heart pounding so loudly I was convinced he could hear it through the mattress. Noticing my change in pace, Dennis paused and asked, "Are you all right?" His voice, now a bit louder than before, carried genuine concern, yet it also held an undercurrent of insistence. I managed only a nod, my voice failing me in the charged silence that followed. The closeness of the moment, the physical contact, it all felt too intense to process in words. After that night, Dennis began to find even more excuses to make contact. During our afternoon walks in the garden, his hand would brush against mine with a light, almost accidental touch. When he handed me a glass of wine, his fingers would briefly graze my skin, leaving a sensation that lingered long after the contact had ended. These small, seemingly trivial moments added up, creating a persistent awareness of his presence that was both unnerving and oddly captivating. One afternoon, when the rest of the household was occupied elsewhere, we found ourselves alone by the pool. The open space made the silence between us even more palpable. As we talked casually about nothing in particular, I suddenly noticed him moving closer. His gaze never left me, and before I could react, he whispered, "You should wear dresses like that more often." His words were soft, but they carried a weight that made my heart race uncontrollably. At that moment, his fingers brushed lightly against my clavicle, a touch so slight yet so deliberate that it sent a jolt through my entire body. I couldn't help but respond in a hushed voice, "This is wrong." The words felt inadequate, barely a whisper against the charged atmosphere that had settled between us. Dennis didn't reply. Instead, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that said more than any words could. There was a silent understanding there, a mix of desire and warning that left me both confused and alarmed. That night, sleep eluded me. Every minute in the darkness was filled with the memory of his touches, the way his hand had lingered on my skin, the way his fingers had traced an invisible path along my back. Even when I lay still, I could almost feel his presence, a series of phantom touches that left me questioning whether they were real or simply a product of my restless mind. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the vivid recollections of our encounters. Each time I closed my eyes, I was drawn back to those moments, the serious look in his eyes, the weight of his hands, and the unspoken promise of more to come. I wondered what these interactions meant for me and for the delicate balance of my life. The more I replayed the events in my mind, the clearer it became that nothing was as simple as it once had been. After dinner that night, Dennis stayed in my room far longer than was proper. The dinner had ended quietly, and most of the house was settling down for the night. I had retreated to my room, planning only to unwind, but Dennis's unexpected presence changed everything. He sat in the dim light near the doorway, his gaze fixed on me. I tried to ignore the tension, but his prolonged presence was hard to dismiss. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke. "Do you trust me?" he asked softly, his tone measured and serious. His finger traced lightly over my wrist as if seeking an answer written there. I froze, not knowing how to respond to such a direct question at that moment. His touch was deliberate, and the question hung heavily in the charged silence of the room. I didn't say anything, words failed me under the weight of his inquiry. The moment passed slowly, each second stretching out with unspoken questions and uncertain promises. I sat there, caught between the need to speak and the instinct to remain silent. His eyes searched mine, as if expecting a response that I couldn't give. That night, the room felt too small, too filled with conflicting emotions for me to find any comfort. When the clock ticked into the early hours, he finally left, leaving behind more questions than answers. The next day, the tension seemed to follow us into the daylight. In the morning, as I was getting ready, Dennis casually asked for my help in choosing some shirts. I wasn't expecting this request, but I sensed it was another chance for him to draw me closer, to blur the lines between what was appropriate and what wasn't. I followed him to his room, where he had laid out several crisp shirts on the bed. With a relaxed smile, he said, "I always doubt such things," as he began unbuttoning the top buttons of one of the shirts. The casual air of the moment did little to diminish the intensity one felt. His tan chest was on full display, and a thin line of hair trailed down his neck, accentuating the contour of his body. I couldn't help but notice every detail, the slight rise and fall of his chest, the confidence in his movements, and the unwavering focus in his eyes. My mouth went dry as I realized how deeply these small gestures affected me. As I bent over to adjust the collar of one of the shirts, the space between us suddenly shrank even further. In that vulnerable moment, I reached out to smooth a wrinkle in the fabric, and Dennis swiftly moved his hand to stop me. His fingers, warm and intentional, grazed the side of my neck. The touch was light, yet it sent a powerful jolt through my entire body. I felt as if I were being pulled into a current, the simple contact leaving me disoriented and overwhelmed. It was as if I were drowning in the intensity of the moment, unable to find my breath or regain control. For a long, suspended second, time seemed to stand still as our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, a mix of desire, uncertainty, and something I couldn't quite place. I struggled to gather my thoughts, to push away the tide of conflicting emotions that threatened to consume me. The situation was dangerous, and yet it had a pull I couldn't easily resist. Every instinct screamed that I should pull back, that the boundaries between us were becoming too blurred, too dangerous. Just as the tension reached its peak and I felt completely lost in that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside my room. The sound cut through the charged silence like a knife. At that instant, both Dennis and I jerked away from each other. The abrupt sound of my mother's steps forced us into a sudden, awkward retreat. We both froze, and the charged atmosphere dissolved into a mix of guilt and panic. In that fleeting moment, I realized that everything was teetering on a knife's edge. The boundaries we had already crossed now threatened to expose us. The silent question from the night before and the lingering tension in the morning had all led to this precarious situation. As the footsteps grew louder and closer, I hurriedly adjusted the shirt, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. Dennis, equally shaken, stepped back and avoided eye contact. By the time the door opened, the room was filled with a heavy silence and a desperate need to retreat from the dangerous intimacy we had flirted with. The incident left me reeling, caught between the desire for more and the harsh reality of our situation. We could no longer hide it, not even from ourselves. The tension had been building for weeks, every stolen glance and forbidden touch pulling us closer to an inevitable line we dared not cross, until that night. My mother was away at a high-profile social event, leaving the house unusually quiet and the secrets we harbored to whisper in the dark. I slipped out into the garden, hoping to find a moment of peace amid the shadows. The cool night air and soft glow of the garden lights offered a fragile sense of calm that was quickly shattered by a presence behind me. Before I could turn, I heard a low, trembling whisper, "I can't take it anymore." It was Dennis. In one swift movement, he emerged from the darkness and closed the gap between us. His arms wrapped around my waist with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. I felt the firmness of his grip and the heat of his body press against mine. In that instant, any lingering resistance within me melted away. I didn't push him off. Instead, I allowed the moment to unfold, even as a part of me screamed that this was dangerous. Dennis's embrace was relentless. I could feel his heartbeat drumming against my side as he pulled me closer, and his hands roamed with a boldness that belied the quiet of the night. His lips found the sensitive skin of my neck, sending jolts of warmth through me. Every touch was deliberate, a mix of longing and an unspoken challenge to the boundaries we had both tried to maintain. The garden around us, bathed in dim light and filled with the subtle rustle of leaves, became our secret arena, where every whisper of the wind seemed to echo the rapid beating of my heart. Despite the overwhelming sensations, I managed to find my voice, albeit weak and uncertain. "We must stop," I said, the words heavy with the weight of reality. Yet, even as I spoke, I didn't pull away. My body remained motionless, caught between the urge to flee and the magnetic pull of the moment. I was aware that this was a turning point, a moment when denial was no longer an option, and the consequences of our actions would change everything. For a long, suspended moment, we simply stood there in the garden's muted light, the only sound the steady rhythm of our breathing. Dennis's eyes searched mine, trying to decipher the storm of emotions swirling within me through fear, guilt, and a desire so fierce it nearly drowned out all rational thought. The intensity of his gaze, combined with the warmth of his proximity, made it impossible for me to retreat into the safety of silence. Yet, the words I had spoken hung in the air, a fragile barrier between us and the reality we were about to embrace. Then, leaning even closer, Dennis whispered into my ear, his voice low and conspiratorial, "Say that again, if you really want it." His breath was warm against my skin, and the softness of his tone contrasted sharply with the stark reality of our situation. It was both an invitation and a challenge, a test of my resolve and the strength of the feelings I had tried so hard to suppress. In that charged instant, the garden seemed to shrink around us, enclosing us in a bubble of forbidden intimacy. I found myself at a crossroads. Every instinct urged me to retreat, to preserve the safety of the known and the consequences of silence. Yet, the allure of this dangerous connection pulled me deeper into a realm where reason and restraint no longer held sway. My heart pounded in my chest as I weighed the risks against the desperate yearning that had taken root within me over the past weeks. Caught in this maelstrom of conflicting emotions, I chose silence. I said nothing further. My silence was not an answer, it was an admission of everything that lay unspoken between us. In that moment, as Dennis's words echoed in my ears and the night deepened around us, our future hung precariously in the balance. The Lakeside house was our refuge. In the early days, we behaved cautiously, yet every touch and every glance smoldered like embers on the verge of a flame. The quiet isolation of the house gave us space from the prying eyes of the world, and we clung to our secrecy like a desperate lifeline. It was a place where time slowed and reality faded, replaced by a dangerous intimacy that neither of us had anticipated. That night was particularly warm, the summer heat lingering in the air as if refusing to let go. I found myself standing by the window, staring into the darkness outside. The night was quiet and thick with possibility, each star a silent witness to the forbidden connection unfolding within these walls. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary that evening, yet deep down I sensed that everything was on the brink of change. Without warning, I felt him approach from behind. Before I could turn, his arms slid around my waist, pulling me close. I felt the heat of his body envelop me, a warmth that was both comforting and terrifying. His presence was overwhelming, his scent mingling with the night air, creating an intoxicating haze. I knew in that instant that he was here to push us further down a path from which there might be no return. His voice, low and measured, broke the silence as he spoke close to my ear. "If you leave now, I won't stop," he warned, his lips trailing softly along the line of my shoulder. There was no malice in his tone, only a raw determination that chilled and thrilled me at the same time. I stood there, frozen by the intensity of his words and the magnetic pull of his touch. I did not leave. In that charged moment, we allowed the tension to break over us. We fell onto the bed in a clumsy, desperate motion, as if the act itself was the only thing keeping us tethered to reality. I felt his weight settle on top of me. His body, solid and unwavering, pressed me down into the soft mattress. His breath was close, a rapid cadence that filled the space between us, and his hot palms roamed along my skin, each touch igniting sparks that raced along my nerves. It was inevitable. Every forbidden moment, every unspoken desire had led us to this climax of our secret existence. His hands grew more impatient as our breathing melded into one, our heartbeats sinking in an unspoken rhythm. I surrendered to the sensations, sinking deeper into a blissful oblivion where nothing mattered except the heat of our passion. I was lost in the merging of our bodies, each caress drawing us further away from the life we had known, each stolen moment wrapping us in a haze of desire and desperation. But just as the intensity reached its peak, a sudden shift tore us apart. "Damn," he suddenly croaked, his voice raw with a mixture of pain and shock as he jerked away abruptly. I opened my eyes, still disoriented by the rush of moments before, trying to understand what had just shattered our reverie. There he was, sitting on the edge of the bed, his head cradled in his hands as if in torment. The sudden change in his demeanor left me breathless and confused. "We cannot," he said, his voice trembling with a broken resolve. It was as though the realization of what we had done had finally hit him, a crushing awareness of the irreversible line we had crossed. I reached out with trembling fingers, calling softly, "Dennis," but he pulled away, his face etched with conflict and regret. "I love you, but this will destroy everything," he whispered, his words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. In that moment, every promise, every secret, every lie that had led us to this point seemed to unravel. His confession was both a declaration and a lament, a sorrowful acknowledgement that the bond we had nurtured might be our undoing. Before I could respond, a sound from downstairs shattered the fragile bubble we had created. The unmistakable creak of a door echoing through the quiet corridors sent a jolt of terror through me. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until a voice pierced the silence from below. "Elizabeth? Dennis? I know you're there," my mother's voice called out, calm yet laced with an unmistakable threat. The tone carried the weight of authority and anger, and in that single moment, the world we had built began to crumble around us. The sanctity of our hidden sanctuary was violated by the intrusion of reality. I held my breath, frozen in place, as the implications of that sound rippled through the room. The spell of our beautiful madness was breaking, the intense fervor of our stolen hours collapsing under the sudden pressure of consequence. Everything we had tried so desperately to keep hidden, the dangerous allure, the whispered promises, the fervent touches, was now exposed, raw and unprotected. I held my breath, feeling our beautiful madness crumble right before our eyes.